I think he was proudest of things that now are actually unfashionable. I think he was very proud of looking after people that he worked with. He was terribly modest, and it was to a fault. He was not interested in himself, which is why he was an interesting actor. The things that he was extraordinary at were being almost an outsider, which actually was sort of what he was. I remember, and I must have been 2, going to see him play Falstaff. And I had a wonderful godmother who meant the world to me, who was an actress. And she took me. And most children don't want to sit through a lot of, certainly Shakespeare. But I wouldn't budge once I was there. And I remember sitting on the step at Stratford. And the step had a painted, it was, you know, the textural thing was, it was carpet and then paint on the top, which is not normal. And I remember sitting on there, and I wouldn't budge because I thought I was going to be taken away. And it was the best kind of moving game I'd ever seen, and the colours, and I remember him being hit. He was there was a bit of whacking going on, though he was padded quite hard. I was very worried he might have been hurt with somebody was hitting him with a stick. But the care of that he had always about language and ideas. As always, as actors, you are usually they're good parents, but strangely not there, because in the evening they've got to go and do something. So, but he did do the best that he could as a dad. He really did, with all of us. The language was something that he was brought up by his Welsh grandfather, and he was an only child of divorced parents, which in those days was quite rare, and my mum was as well. They both were, and so his world was a very imaginative world, as it usually is, and sort of he was thrown back on himself quite a lot, and he grew up in Southport, which I've just been up in Liverpool, and I kept thinking of him, and I kept walking because I'd gone to see the Liverpool Biennale, and I kept thinking of him a lot because I walked everywhere seeing different art shows, and it was very funny because I felt very close. I hadn't been thinking about him really. I'd want to see the art shows, but I see that when he was growing up, it was still a huge, huge, thriving port. Well, it was on his legs, really, underneath. His childhood in Southport, he used to go to the end of the pier in Southport and see this guy who had one leg from the First, or maybe even before the First World War, who used to ride a bicycle off the end of the pier. And then somehow he would be fished out, or he'd swim back and get his bicycle back. But he used to do it for pennies. And I remember Dad saying that's how he understood adventure, and that's what he wanted to do with his life. Not have one leg and throw himself off a pier. But actually he did spend most of his time doing very dangerous things and throwing himself off piers, as it were. He did. That was in his nature. His grandpa had tried to give him the best education he could, so he actually had a private education, and he went to rugby, though he didn't stay very terribly long. It's typical of Dad that it was half establishment, but then he'd go ugh, and then he'd go, oh no, I can't bear it. And so, but his grammar and his rhetoric was based on classical rhetoric, so it would be Greek and Latin, which gave him a completely different kind of education to the ones that kids have now. Dad, although he was a good atheist, as I said, he brought us up as sort of good atheists, though it wasn't really touched on terribly. It just was, well, whatever you like, but I can't believe in it, I'm sorry. The language of the Old Testament was something as well. He knew chunks off by heart. He knew reams of it. And the same thing about the myths, Greek stuff. His language skills were pretty good. So this is me going a rather long way around saying that actually his language skills were good. His French was good. His German was good. His Italian was good. And once the basic Latin root is there, you can do anything with it. And so those language skills were very helpful for him. When he joined up, first he joined up as an ordinary private, and then he was interested in doing SOE, and it was the first time that it was a character-based job or part of the army. So this sort of resistance, this sort of idea of danger was always, it was just self-selective, because he was always interested in it. He would always do things, always do stuff that was a little bit, not dodgy, but he'd put himself in a dangerous situation. One of the things he loved to do when we were little, he had a canoe, and it was a canoe that was canvas, and it had struts. It had ribs, and you could put it in a bag. So he used to, first of all, he was canoeing and was thinking about things, so he would take my mum and they'd go off to Lake Windermere, and then he got a little sail that you could put a little sail up on the canoe, and then he'd be chasing around on this little, we now call it a kayak actually. And then he got really interested in sailing. And then we used to sail, and he learnt to sail on a catamaran, which was little. It was, 12 foot, I think? But it could sleep. Most of the family would sleep on this in the hulls. Anyway. And he would go out, and we had a little outboard motor, but it was mainly, it was sail. And we would go out when the harbour master was coming back in and all the fishermen were coming back in, and we'd go out. And I remember being 7 standing on an orange box so that I could get to the tiller and everything like this and see over the top of had a little coach house. And we'd go out when it was blowing up a heck of a storm, but that was what he liked. And this harbour master would be waving at him saying, "I got my eye on you, Tony." And, it would be like, okay, we're watching when you come back in. But that's him. When he started in the profession, when he started out acting, his looks were not straight leading man material. He had his granny was Polish Jewish, his grandpa was very Welsh. His temperament was not Anglo-Saxon, not at all. Not at all. Everyone, all at home, there was a lot of crying, there was a lot of hugging. It was very un-Anglo-Saxon. And I think certainly his looks meant that so where was he going to be? And because of this only child that he had been, and actually I think rather a lonely only child, I've seen photos of his mum and him, and I think that this was, and there's one when he's in a little Mac, and it's far too short for him, and I'm thinking, he doesn't look happy. He's not looking a happy kid, an outward going kid. He looks a rather bookish kid, not very happy. And so I think that acting is often the shy person's, and he was shy too. Most actors, good actors, are very shy. And it's the shy person's way of expressing an imaginative life, which is as strong for them as an adult as it is for children when they're small. I think he was proudest of things that now are actually unfashionable. I think he was very proud of looking after people that he worked with. I think that it wasn't to do with the acting so much as he was terribly modest, and it was to a fault. He was not interested in himself, which is why he was an interesting actor. The things that I have heard from other people the things that he was extraordinary at were being almost an outsider, which actually was sort of what he was. So though he did a lot of parts where people thought he was, oh yes, in the army and he was English, but yes, but no, yes, but no, but yes. But I think that he was wonderful as Aaron the Moor. I think he was wonderful, I can see it from the photographs, wonderful as Moscow in Volpone. I think that his Falstaff, which was filmed towards the end of, there was a whole load of Shakespeare's that were done. I thought he was wonderful. He cut it to the bone. And it was very honest and very self-searching. They were things that they were sort of, it's character acting kind of things that I think he was wonderful at. But there's an honesty sometimes about his work. Oedipus, there was a film of Oedipus which I thought was terrific. It was uncomfortable to watch, and it should be mighty uncomfortable to watch. Those are the things that I think he would not say about any of his work. He wouldn't say about it, but he was most proud of working with people and making a great team and looking after them, the team of the theatre, and brought us up like that it isn't just the actors. In fact, the actors are just the, icing. It's what's behind it. And from the cutters of the clothes to the, and I remember him saying, why should anybody do anything for you unless you look after them? Why? It's a tough but practical. I think this attitude was kind of prevalent with certain actors who were extremely unsnobby and had been through the war. And I think it was a sort of camaraderie which I know Dad found acting actually found out who he was in a funny way. He played Noah in a production that he did, and I have heard other people who had then at the time said it was a very interesting performance, and I can see again from photographs it was interesting. Again, sort of oddball. He was an oddball. He, I think, was proud of differentiating, as actors have to do, for either screen or there's screen acting, then there's tele acting, which comes into your room, and then there's acting in the theatre, and they require completely different techniques, though obviously the two filmed or video areas are much closer, and it requires a level of honesty and acting at cost, which I think that he was proud of some of what he managed to do. You can't do it all the time because it's an odd one, but certainly I would say at the end of Ice Cold in Alex, when he's been taken off on a truck, I find that is one of those moments which is extremely, he doesn't even speak, but you know what he's thinking, and that's lovely acting. It's a funny one because you have your father or your mother or whoever it is in the family is a public and a private person. In a way, as a child, you resent the public person because they're being public. And the one photo that I have of him, and I love of him, it's tiny. It's a little snap from a holiday snap. And he's just being a dad. He's just smiling like, yeah, take your photo with your little Kodak. But he's not doing any posy acty faces. He's not doing any of that stuff, which all actors can't help but do it. So there is always this professional face and the private face. Dad was always extremely hardworking and also wayward. And he decided what he wanted to do he must have been in his 70s, wasn't he? Late 60s, 70s, when he started his own theatre company. And that it would go on tour, and then it would come into the West End. And this was something that he truly wanted to do and believed in. I remember him hatching this plan, and it seemed kind of crazy because, you know, he wasn't a baby. But he was so happy to do it. And the fact that it was called Compass, because, you know, he was always sailing, and the idea that you have your own inner compass that, you know, will point whichever way and you've got to go, was him. And the first play they did was the Clandestine Marriage, and Roy Kinnear was in it. I didn't know Roy terribly well. I just I did one television with him, but I was absolutely blown away by him. He reminded me of a child, and I mean that in the best possible way. It was a child, you just wanted to hug him and laugh, and he made you laugh, but then laughing is saying, love me. Real comics give themselves completely, and they blow you away with how much they give, you know. An actor is always, yeah, but he's a little bit back, he's keeping something here. It's at cost, he does, but the comic, it's a total cost to himself. It was very funny. I remember seeing it, it was an absolute joy of a play. It was kind of, well, wacky, and they all in it had a ball. You just knew all the actors enjoyed each other's company very much, and it was a sort of lovely grotesque piece, and it was a success. After he died, I was on tour with ESC, and every theatre that I went to where they had gone, people, stage doorman, the dressers, the people that for him really mattered, they all said, lovely, lovely man, your dad. And then they stopped and I went, yeah, he was a lovely man, and it was just so touching. And then they went, and his dog, and I said, yes, Tiger. He had a dog, which he was very strict with us actually growing up, but this dog was so spoilt, and it was the worst trained dog you've ever met. And all of them would say, you're a lovely dad. And I'd say, yes, and then just go, and then Tiger. And I said, I know. I know. He was very spoilt. Actors are honest to the time they live. Stage actors are, because things aren't recorded. It's part of the time. So I'm very glad that there are some movies and there is some telly of work that he did, and certainly work that he did later in life when he was actually trying to pare back and do less and less and less for the camera. I wished it was a time just after the war. I was aware that as a child that a lot of actors had been through hell. And I remember Dad saying about Harry Andrews' feet, and he just said, just relax your toes, they're like this. You're walking around like this. And, you know, we're trained as actors now to go, and the wrists and the thing and a balance, and, you know, it's a completely different kind of training that young actors have. I think a far more physical one, where the word is important, but physicality is taken into account as well, and there's a certain amount of training and rigour that goes into that. So what? Well, I'll tell you something funny. My mum, she kept on dying, really. She had about 6 times, she had chronic asthma, and I was living nearest to the hospital, so they'd ring me up and I would go. And I remember one time driving, it was the early hours of the morning, and I thought, they said, come quick, she's on her way out. And so I just remember saying, Dad, oh, Dad. And he hadn't died that long before, it was about 6 years, I think. But I remember thinking, this has got to be the one. And I remember thinking, oh, Dad, like this. And then I looked up, I stopped at the lights, there was no one else on the road. I looked up, I was by a pub, and what it said there's written up was Courage, because it was Courage Ales. And I went, yeah, thanks, Dad. But that's what he had, and that's what he left.